Hi, my name is Alex and welcome back to Magic Missile Minis. Today I'm going to be sculpting one of the characters in my current D&D party, who's a robot orc barbarian. To start, I take a piece of wire and bend it in half. I clamp that down with some pliers and begin to twist it together to create the spine for the armature. I then bend out some hips as well as some legs into the bottom of those two pieces of wire that are left over. I then create a small indentation in both of those pieces of wires to create an indication for where the knee joint is going to be. The next step is to take a long piece of wire and fold a little loop into the center. I place that loop over the spine and then clamp that down to create the shoulders and arms. To keep that in place, I add a little bit of super glue. The next step was to pose the miniature. The pose that I had in mind was fairly simple. You'd be standing and kind of brandishing or showing off the metal robotic arm that the character has. An important point of order, this character is not actually a barbarian. It is a custom class that the player playing it designed himself and then made a variation of for this character that is essentially a kind of cyborg class. Obviously, that's not going to be helpful for making a video, so I just called it a barbarian, but all of you who actually watched it know what the character is. I think it's called a mechanist is what he named it. But once the miniature is posed, I add a first layer of green stuff and attach it to a cork bottle as a sculpting handle, and then I start to sculpt out the torso. The reason I alluded to the character being similar to a barbarian is because he's this barrel-chested orc character that is a fighting melee class, so it's very similar. The character is a miner, as in salt mine, not legal drinking age. Once I've built the miniature up a little bit with some green stuff, I start thinking about what parts of the model are going to have exposed anatomy. So here I start working on his arms because he's going to be wearing a sleeveless work shirt. As I work on this, I realize I should probably use a reference a little bit more than I do, because while my knowledge suffices for making a monster, it's a little bit rocky for doing really accurate anatomy for humanoid miniatures. I say that because I feel like a lot of YouTubers or tutorial people, especially when it comes to arts, will say oh, you gotta use reference, and then you don't see them using reference. So this is me saying that I'm no better than anyone and I need to use reference as well. Once I finish that, I start working on the shirt. I add a piece of green stuff over the top of his torso and start kind of working out the straps that are going to go over his shoulders. As I press this green stuff into the body, I'm thinking about the different folds that are going to come right at the base of the shirt where his shirt is tucked into his belt. And I go ahead and repeat that same process on his back and attach the green stuff on either side around the sides of his hips. To create the folds, I do some very simple zigzag lines to create some fairly basic folds in clothing. The next step was to start working on the head. The way I decided to do it this time was to start by making the base of the head, trying to emphasize the brow, the temples, and the cheekbones as much as possible in this first layer. And then once I let that set, I start working on the eyes. I wanted to do something slightly differently, where in the past I've done the eyes to let it set and then added the eyelids. I wondered if I could sculpt the lower eyelid and the eye itself in one piece. I don't think I will do this again because this was surprisingly, well, I shouldn't say surprisingly, it wasn't particularly surprising how difficult it was and at the scale that I'm trying to sculpt this. I tried several times, you can see I tried with my needle, I also tried with my X-Acto blade. It is very difficult. I really like how this turned out, but I think there's better ways to do it, and I probably should have just sculpted the eye and then the lower eyelid separately. But I somehow managed to repeat the process on the other side, and after that had set, I start working on the mouth. The way I normally do mouths is by making one piece of green stuff and splitting it in half to create the upper and lower lip, and then playing with it to make sure that it looks right. I like to do this step before adding the nose because even though it kind of starts to look like an alien or specifically like a Tau, for those of you who know Warhammer, it's very helpful to do the lips this way because it's important to create the correct shape for the almost beak-like shape you can see above the upper lip. While the head sets, I add a belt onto the main part of the miniature, simply adding a piece of green stuff and wrapping that around the base of the mini and then flattening that. The next step was to add a little bit of green stuff onto the feet because the wires I had attached were kind of falling apart. So I loosely build up the material so that I can add some boots later on. With that material added, I add a little bit more green stuff onto the belt to create the belt buckle. I add a little piece of green stuff and wrap it around the top and the bottom, and then add another piece of green stuff to be the little latch that is inside the belt buckle. I feel like I probably could have done this smaller, especially considering the size of some other parts of the miniature, but overall it still looked pretty good. Another detail I wanted to add was a mask. This is a part of the character's class features as he kind of puts on the mask and goes into this kind of rage type effect for the game, and he gets a bunch of stats, and it's really cool and sounds really awesome. And so I add this little gas mask here, creating a fairly simple triangular shape, and then I add 2 spheres onto the sides of the gas mask to create the little canisters. After that, I go back to work on the face, starting with the upper brow to start working on a more solidified expression. Again, this is supposed to be an orc, so he's going to have really defined, kind of angry brow as he's kind of, again, brandishing his arm and looking all intimidating and aura farming and every good thing. So using my needle tool, I create a separation as well as some indentations into that, as well as then going in and adding a nose. I add a triangle of green stuff and then work out the nostrils with my needle. I then also add a little bit more green stuff around the side of the face to bulk it out and give him a little bit more of a defined jawline, since his face was looking a little bit too slender for an orc's. I then remember he's an orc, and so I add a little bit more space around the lips to create room for the tusks that I'll add later on. The next step was to start working on the robot arm. I decided I would do this actually more like scratch building it using wires and other things to try to make it look really convincing. So here I take a little bit of a ball of green stuff and stick it at the end of a thicker wire. And then using some styrene tubing, I place that over the wire to create a kind of piston-like effect for the main bulk of what would essentially be the bicep for the mechanical arm. To create a mechanical elbow for this miniature, I take a little piece of styrene, stab a hole in it, and then drill a smaller hole that's about the size of my wire into the front half. This way I'll be able to insert the wire of the main arm into this little hole, and it'll have a really solid bond beyond just being superglued in place. In order to add an extra little detail, I wanted to add another tiny piece of wire alongside the main piece of wire, just to add a little bit more interest and a little bit more detail into this. I also take these small loops of wire to create these kinds of piping that are sticking out of the main body of the arm. Unfortunately, later on, I think a couple of these fall off, which I'm very disappointed by. I thought they would look really cool, but at that point I had already painted it and it was a little bit too late to attach them again. In order to create the forearm, I do the same method I had done before with the wire through the piece of styrene, but then I cut this piece of styrene in half so it creates what's going to be the back of the hand, or a kind of palm. In order to beef up this part of the miniature, I also add another piece of long wire next to the main larger piece of wire. I then, very, very meticulously, and probably should have used tweezers, but here I am with my small pliers, super glue a series of small wires to act as all of the individual fingers for the hand. I don't know if this was the best decision to make, but at the very end, honestly, I really liked how it looked, so I'm kind of glad that I went through the pains of fidgeting with these little wires and super glue to get them in place. Once I have his fist finished, I can then take a little bit more of the super glue and attach that onto just the bottom of the round elbow joint that we had. To make it look a little bit more seamless, I also take another wire to create another cable going into that arm. With that, I can remove the kind of temporary arm that I had posed at the side of the miniature and take some super glue to attach onto this new mechanical arm that he has. And with that in place, and in order to add a little bit more unity between the arm and the miniature, I add another one of the cables going into his pecs and then into the main part of the arm, just to make it flow into him a little bit better, make it look like it's really connected. With that finished, I take some time to sculpt in the boots, adding little creases around the top where the boots would be bending a bunch, and once that lower part had set, I add a little bit more green stuff over top to kind of create a lip for the boots themselves. After that, it was time to take the face which had set and take it off of the little sculpting handle I was using and attach it onto the miniature. I just take a piece of green stuff, stick it onto the extra piece of wire for his neck, and leave that to set before I keep working the miniature. With that added, I also take a little piece of green stuff to add his tusks that are coming out of the lips that we had edited earlier. And then the next step was to add his goggles. The idea with when he uses his arm and puts the gas mask on, he also pops these goggles down. So he's got this full face mask type thing that's separated into a series of little pieces. I add two basically discs of green stuff on top of each other to create the circular rim of the goggles and then the lenses of the goggles themselves. Once I had that where I liked it, I take a tiny piece of green stuff to act as the piece of leather that is connecting the two goggles. With that finished, I add a little bit of green stuff onto the back of the head and start sculpting in his hair. I decided I would just have it fairly simple and slicked back since he's got the goggles and I wouldn't have to worry about obstructing the goggles or anything like that. Once I add a hair in the way that I like it, I add a piece of green stuff that'll wrap around his head to act as the leather strap that is connecting the goggles. Once that is done, I add a little triangle of green stuff to act as his ears. And since he's an orc, I have them be a little short, but still a little bit pointed. This character also has mutton chops and a mustache that connects them, so I very quickly go in and add that facial hair, and as you can see, my own hair gets in the camera, so sorry about that. I've also always thought that this specific facial hair is really fun and kind of cool, and I was very excited when my friend was telling me that his character had this specific facial hair. One of the things I noticed at this point in the miniature was that he wasn't looking like big enough or barrel-chested enough, so I take a little bit of green stuff and add that over the shirt to just make him look a little bit bigger. After that, I can start working on the hand. The hand for this miniature was just going to be in a fairly basic fist. He's kind of getting ready to like fight or something like that. Again, kind of brandishing the robotic arm. So I add that on really quick, just a very simple fist. With that, the miniature was basically finished. So I added to the base, but one of the things I realized I wanted to add another piece of wire into the arm because it was looking a little bit thin now that I had made him look a little bit bigger with the extra green stuff. So I take a large piece of wire and just stick that onto the side of the arm to make it look a little bit bigger. As I was working on this, I realized also that there wasn't any green stuff really connecting the arm, so I take a little bit of green stuff and try to create what would look like a little bit of a scarring texture that wraps around the metal pieces going into the arm to make it look like you can still see kind of where the scars are of how it's attached to his shoulder. These kinds of details I find really help make a miniature look really cool. I also decided since I was sculpting some stuff that I add an extra little belt onto there because I thought it would be cool. And to add to the list of things that I'm remembering last minute, the character always had this ripcord that he pulled, so I added that as well. This is the final sculpt of the miniature. I'm very proud of it. While we check it out, I wanted to thank all of my patrons. If you guys want to go check out the Patreon, you can using the links in the description. Here's the names of my patrons currently. And as of recently, I am back on posting regularly on my Patreon. I was behind for a little bit, but please go check that out if you want to support me financially. I'm actually posting there now, so you can go check that out. Also, I'm in a band. We recently released a single. This is what it sounds like.
All the kids are running away from home. Never had a place for them to know who they are, how to live. Don't look like that, don't live like this.
So if you like that sound, go check us out. We're called Kin. But anyways, on with the painting. The character actually decided he was going to be a blue orc rather than a green orc. So I base coat the whole miniature in a dark blue and then start with this main exposed arm to create highlights using a medium color blue to get the majority of the miniature, avoiding the darkest parts, and then later on coming on with a highlight color to get the brightest points and, generally speaking, the tallest, highest points of the arm. The technique I tend to use when highlighting is using wet blending, so I make sure that the paints that I'm using are wet while they're going on the miniature, so I can mix them together as I'm painting on the mini, rather than using something like glazing. In order to create the scarring effect, though, I water down a red-purple paint and go over all the texture that we had added to just create a little like scarring effect. That I start to paint the shirt. I start with just base coating it with a white, and then I play around with ways of making it look a little bit dirty. I didn't want to use a normal wash because my washes have been giving me a lot of trouble, so instead I cover it in a watered down yellow, and then I mix a bunch of white into to create a slightly different mid-tone shadow tone. I go back in with the regular white to kind of push and pull the highlights to make sure it looks natural and a little bit grimy. In order to enhance the grime, I also go in with a much darker brown and just dot that throughout the miniature. I work on the pants next, doing a fairly basic brown, and then I take a darker brown to do all of the leathers. To finish the leathers and make them look separate from the pants, I also take a light yellow and work on all of the edges, adding a very rough edge highlighting, as well as some scrapes and scratches onto the leather. I find that this really helps make a worn leather feel to create these little divots and scratches over the entirety of the leather. After that, it was time to start painting the arm. I mix a little bit of gold with some red to create a copper feel, since I wanted this to be kind of steampunk-ish. And then I cover some of the other details with a silver, more gunmetal paint to create some variation within the arm itself. To create some highlights, I played around with a couple different things, but I found that after trying some gold highlights on all of the copper, I instead went with a color that I mixed together, adding a little bit of white to the copper that I made and a little bit more gold. So it wasn't strictly just a gold highlight, it just looked a lot better. In order to get the goggles, I add a little bit of blue. I tried to do some kind of gradient here. It mostly worked. The main distinguishing features I add is a soft light blue highlight on one end and then a dot of white on the other. And that helps convey that there's kind of a glass feel. The next thing to do was work on the eyes. So what I generally do for that is I don't paint the face. I usually start with the eyes and add a lot of white paint over the eyes, more than I'm definitely going to be seeing, adding the pupils with black, and then coming back over with some flesh tone to cover up and then define the borders of where the eyes are. This technique worked really well for this miniature in particular. I found that I really liked the size of the eyes, and I'd really suggest doing this for anybody who's painting eyes. Rather than trying to get a bunch of tiny little highlights in, you just cover it with a lot of the paint, you put in the pupils, and then you cover the edges with some highlights and with your base flesh tone. I add a tiny little bit of purple onto the lips, and then I move on to paint the hair, which is a fairly simple watered down white, since the character has white hair, and because it's watered down, the see-through will create a little bit of variance in the tone and color of the hair. I add a little bit of my brown wash over the arm just to get into some of the crevices and details before I go in with a little bit more of the gunmetal to finish up details like the belt buckle. The last step of the miniature was just to paint a little simple dirt texture for the ground, and the miniature was finished. This is, I'm really proud of this miniature. I think the only issue I have with it is I wish his head was a little bit smaller. I had upscaled the size of the head to make sure that his jawline was right, but it made his head a little bit too big. Overall, I'm really happy with the arm. The eyes are definitely the best I don't think I've painted eyes as well as I have on this miniature. So overall, I'm very proud of this mini. And I was actually able to show this miniature to the guy who's playing the character because I finished it the day we were playing, so that was really fun. But hopefully we'll be able to see all of these characters together when I finish the series. Thank you so much for watching that video. I really hope you guys enjoyed it. If you did, let me know in the comments, leave a like, subscribe, do all of the algorithm things. It is a huge help. Before you leave, I also wanted to mention the Patreon again. If you want to support me financially, I have caught up on my backlog of Patreon stuff that I was meant to be doing. I am posting there actively again. So if you don't mind, go check that out. I really appreciate the support. But once again, thank you so much for watching this video, and I will see you guys in the next one.